Today's video is being brought to you with help from G Fuel. As most of you know, I actually use this product myself, typically during creation and editing aspects of my videos, and have found it quite useful when not feeling like I want to work. If you too are interested in getting your hands on some, either to try it out and see if it's right for you or to resupply your favorite flavor and are looking for a bit of a discount, please use the code TheDsIEGE and get 20% off your next purchase, while at the same time supporting this channel and helping me continue to create the content you've all come to enjoy. I'll leave a link in the description below if you're interested, and thank you in advance for any who choose to purchase using my code. Without further ado, on to the featured presentation.
As I await my final crossing to the past, I ponder what role a scientist may play in so spiritual a matter as absolution. How in the alchemy of the soul, even repentance must necessarily be a calculated task. Only resolute action remained. I will repair what I have broken, no more, no less. The scales must balance. If I must be a demon, let me be an honest one. Let me prove my nature by what I do next. And in such a monstrous penitence as this, I shall take no heed of the dust that may fall upon them on either side. The dust of petty lives. The builders of old tempered their mortar with blood to appease the most ancient of land spirits. We should have been so wise, yet it is not too late to learn. The sands fall, the circuit completes. I return to the place of the beginning. Let witless hordes bleat their disdain for every fervent plan. The deal is done, the die is cast. I end as I began.
Hey all, Siege here, and today I want to talk about an aspect of Whispers in the Walls that, as the story unfolds, especially when considering the information we learn in the aftermath of the quest with Albrecht's lost notes, appears to be visually told through the imagery we see within the tile set itself. The scene in particular I want to focus on is pretty shocking if you are into the narrative that has been building in the game up to that point, shown here.
Look at these things lying around, abandoned. Like you, Lloyd.
Some already know the horrifying implications of what just transpired, but this scene and further what it represents on a few levels is incredibly significant in the grand scheme of the overarching narrative of at least Albrecht's aspect of the story. First, this is the only time the Indifference has spoken in our dialect using what I assume is its true voice.
Abandoned. Like you, Lloyd.
Aside from the... Although that could, in fact, be a form of onomatopoeia, the process of creating a word to mimic a sound it describes. Regardless, it's unique and succeeds in generating more rage in the heart of Lloyd, all the while increasing its presence and making it theoretically stronger in its efforts to overtake the labs, with the walls crumbling more and more as the story unfolds.
You It takes and it takes. It took my future. It's taking the labs inch by inch. Well, I won't let it take his bloody corvia!
And while we are able to calm Lloyd and immobilize the Indifference's attacking vessel, something that originally eluded my gaze up until recently was this chair and its very particular placement in relation to the abandoned vessel, as its captura is entitled. Much like the Zariman 10-0, Albrecht's Labs attempts to tell a story in its own right, and I'd like to show you the narrative aspect to Whispers in the Walls, the abandoned vessel, along with Entrati's own words and actions, I believe, while not being told, is highly likely to be right in front of us the whole time, if we have the eyes to see. In the initial Requiems, we learn that Entrati seemingly pulled away from a deal with the man in the wall, with his outstretched hand allowing the extraction of a finger in the process, presumably the one missing from the wall form we see at the end of the New War, a form most likely assumed from Entrati himself, with the visual likeness of the two being pretty undeniable. And I say this because concept art of the creature depicted its face looking much differently at different points. We even have an in-game glyph that certainly doesn't look like Entrati, and I believe it begs the question, if there are more than one of these, are there more than one of these? Because if you look at the sheer size of what looks like our Vitruvian kaiju unbound from the wall, interestingly enough also found within this same captura, these vessels don't seem like they match up very well. The scenario Entrati appears to believe, at least in some capacity, will work.
I went among the denizens of the plague year like a savior, my hands filled with healing. To those who volunteered, I brought more than mere health. Their bodies were primed. It needed only the Helminth infusions brought from my own time to work the alchemy of transformation. They have become partial Warframes, still in possession of their free will, yet enhanced, void-attuned, capable. Their humanity may not last. My deliverance may yet consume them, the human swallowed up in the sacred beast. And if my wayward disciples turn on me, what words of comfort shall I have beyond? This is the bargain we have made. Through our sacrifice, history will be saved. It was Lloyd who pointed out the singular attributes of the gray strain, how it stimulates growth to monstrous dimensions. Many thoughts converged in me then. What if, through precise biochemical engineering, I could create the equivalence of Warframes, yet built to a titanic scale? Surely such a legion could stand against the adversary? Assuming, of course, that an operator could be found. Not long after, the first of my vessels took form. A giant to battle giants, merging the humanity of the man Arthur, the anatomical perfection of Ballas's Warframes, and the titanic potency of the gray strain. My saviors.
An actual fight against a terrifyingly larger eldritch entity with vessels who may themselves turn at any time always seem to point to there being more to this story. If Albrecht didn't take the deal, how was all of this possible with merely a finger, especially with a scientist who so many seem to believe to not be worth their time or investment, and was even seen as a madman by others? I've asked this question before regarding the building of the Wall of Loke itself, and a simple solution would be, with the help of Euleria, Lloyd, and a bevy of Orcan workers, the creation of that in the upper necrolisc is quite plausible, making up for said deficiencies so many others had already seen in him. But here, without the help of her and having only Lloyd as a confidant and colleague, how was all of this built? The amount of technology and manpower it would require to create this place, and do it in secret, would be almost unfathomable. And that's not even considering its placement. When we are first introduced to the true vastness of Entrati's laboratories during the campaign, it's a pretty mind-blowing experience, especially considering that it's supposed to be located, theoretically at least, within the core of Deimos. From our orbiter, there doesn't seem to be any indication the area underneath the necrolisc is physically connected to the Martian moon, and with this in mind, I feel it very likely the process we witnessed early in the Whispers campaign opened a doorway into either a pocket of the void, perhaps even in the same vein as Granum's void, or another dimension altogether. One even created or maintained with the sole purpose of keeping the area's deepest secrets completely out of reach, with the rest of the family all rooted above being completely unaware that this place even exists. Of course, all of this would be easily possible provided he had help of a particular kind, and the walls themselves may be a good indicator as to the idea's validity. One thing the indifferences reveal of this world's true face proves without a shadow of a doubt, is that here he has power, with the walls literally constructed with the Vitruvian imagery we were first presented with in the New War, his face very prominently being shown in multiple expressions, with odd void energy found all around him, even coming to and from these effigy-like impressions adorned on sand-like structures, the swirls of the void hardened into form. And if you look around some of the walls, particularly where divides exist between the elegant aspects of his labs, in the seemingly ashen areas the man on the wall has encroached upon, it appears the Orican walls are merely crumbling back to their most basic form. Something Captain Vor in his current iteration, appearing periodically in the Undercroft and typically dying so fast his dialogue doesn't even get a chance to play, appears to know the true nature of.
Even as my flesh hardens, a wall of bone awaits my joining.
So, is it not more apt to believe that, like the man in the wall, this area is made of the same material, bone, which actually lines up with the man of the murmur both appears and dies, very dust to dust in its likeness, and maybe even further reinforced by the volume of bodies that were initially given to the Void in Entrati's quest to exact a specific response.
I employed a variety of cavia in an attempt to unmake the adversary. The principle was straightforward enough, though in hindsight I abhor my naivete. My humanity had been unscrolled by the caustic void, and now smirked back at me across the divide, privy to all my unfettered malice and pettiness. In answer, I resolved to hurl into the void minds that were not human.
I don't believe you.
Let it parody them. The proximity of the bestial would force a humbling devolution. Or so I thought. The majority of the cavia merely died. I gave the void living beings, and it sent me back bedraggled cadavers. The dead lay stacked in pyramids around my deserted lab. I was nothing but a
rather disturbing question to ask is, could portions of these very walls be comprised of the bones, unmade into basic dust and repurposed, of those that Entrati fed to the indifference? Warframe's music has a habit of being so good that there will be little reason to mute it in mission. However, should you choose to, you will find that there are a great many literal whispers in these walls that can be heard in almost every part of the labs at one point or another, and they don't all sound the same either. Men, women, potentially even children or animals seem to be trying to communicate, although it's not clear if it's intended for us or for the others. Who do they belong to? At this point, it's not really certain, but could this explain where all the failed experiments are in the present day, and further that Entrati may have even experimented on human beings, potentially those of lower intelligence in line with his other sacrifices? Are the whispers in the walls the literal whispers of the dead? We are made aware during the quest that the Indifference is trying to retake this area, most likely to find Albrecht's secrets in the same manner Parvo's Granum is, but the reason behind that is still unclear, and in fact alludes to the idea that it wanted to keep a page of the grimoire from Lloyd versus actually requiring it for its own purposes. And in this is where I believe the story the walls here in Albrecht's laboratory tells, because the more I look around this place, the more and more I begin to believe that while the first encounter with the man on the wall horrified Entrati as shown in his requiems, this place appears to show the aftermath of when he decided to come to terms with his demon. It's no secret the elements of alchemy are literally all over the place, from alchemical symbols found within Entrati's writing, as well as what appears to be similar imagery within aspects of the void itself, and even his own words, explicitly regarding the alchemy of the soul.
As I await my final crossing to the past, I ponder what role a scientist may play in so spiritual a matter as absolution. How in the alchemy of the soul, even repentance must necessarily be a calculated task. I will repair what I have broken, no more, no less. The scales must balance, and in such a monstrous penitence as this, I shall take no heed of the dust that may fall upon them on either side, the dust of petty lives. The builders of old tempered their mortar with blood to appease the most ancient of land spirits. We should have been so wise, yet it is not too late to learn.
It's very clear this precursor to modern chemistry, steeped in mysticism, became a key aspect of Albrecht's research. Alchemy, in its most basic understanding, is essentially the process of turning or transmuting an item of little value into something precious and desired, commonly personified in the lead to gold analogy. We see this exact concept play out when we transmute mods. The idea being that we take the mods we don't really want and attempt to change them into ones we do, with even the difficulty of such a task being replicated in how infrequently one actually gets the transmutation to grant a more desirable mod. In truth, alchemy in its own right is essentially the pursuit for the Philosopher's Stone, an item of exceptional rarity and even more dubious explanation that could transform lead to gold, as well as having the power to offer the user eternal life, both in theory offering the greatest value. Its surface level meaning, of course, is quite literal in nature, with stories of alchemists both medieval and modern attempting to recreate this process. For those wondering, the procedure required in creating the actual real-world Philosopher's Stone is pretty straightforward and requires only one element: urine. The difficulty comes in the continuous distillation demanded to produce two specific aspects, removing all other contamination in its entirety, recombining the purified desired products, and using heat to change the subject from black, what's known as the negrito, to white, the albedo, and finally red, or the rubedo. It's a painstakingly difficult task to do, and more importantly, to do right, requiring years to accomplish and flawless methods during the process, which is why so few have achieved it. In fact, there is only one known to have done it, and although thought to have died in 1418, people to this day still believe that the great Nicolas Flamel, a French notary who became quite infamous due to his roots in alchemy, is still alive today. The power of the elixir of life, offering he and his wife Perenelle a lifelong journey together through the ages. How much of this is true is anyone's guess, but it does offer us a great deal of information regarding what might have occurred in the time after Entrati had healed from his first encounter with the void.
Too craven to chase death, I awaited it. The father of fears, and yet I was still afraid. The currents whispered, "Coward." I clenched my body into a fist as a fetus must, and blinded myself afresh. Stark pain smoked the juice of my living tomb. Why did the saga not end by itself? Why must I still act. Steeped in solitude, I found I could no longer endure my own company. Disgust did the work of courage. I tore the mundane membrane, slid weak and mucosal into Lloyd's embrace. I had decided to live. The same cursed question still pursued me as it had before. Was I, even now, trapped in the rictus of the wall? The apparatus of logic would never yield an answer. Only resolute action remained. If I must be a demon, let me be an honest one. Let me prove my nature by what I do next. Purpose. Let me leave such blazing footprints behind me as no unclean thing would dare to walk in.
And subsequently found his new purpose. In order to understand this purpose entirely, we must investigate another aspect of the Philosopher's Stone mythos, one that is more metaphorical. You see, in many ways this process can also be seen as a path to the divine within each person on a spiritual level, and according to Carl Jung, believing that alchemical operations were real, only this reality was not physical but psychological, and further that these aspects of the spirit could not be understood conceptually and rather relied on images and symbols to be comprehended. It's here where Entrati's direction may have turned spiritual in nature, and in the same methodology began his process towards enlightenment, making the darkness conscious, purifying himself by essentially first recognizing what most understand as his shadow self, one that in his case appears to have actually manifested, but in most is the aspect of themselves which a person refuses to acknowledge, the voice they keep buried within, and then embracing what has occurred and confronting the shadow within, something very much present in some of the dialogue we find in his lost notes. Now, this is an incredibly difficult undertaking, one according to Jung that we all deal with consistently. The problem is, the nature of the shadow is obtuse. Jung states, if the shadow were obviously evil, there would be no problem whatsoever. But the shadow is merely somewhat inferior, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad. It even contains childish and primitive qualities, which would, in a way, vitalize and embellish human existence, but convention forbids. Does that sound familiar to anyone else? See, Entrati appeared to understand that whether he succeeded or failed, the only true way of dealing with this entity was to acknowledge its existence and confront it. However, it's the nature of his response that could be problematic in the end. This area is eerily similar to imagery associated with a summoning circle, a method by which one may summon, well, typically a demon. A circle is drawn around an area with very specific symbols scribed within its diameter, and an offering is typically made. Looking at the visage of this vessel in particular, the tenno-mimic sits in the same place he did at the end of the New War, only now on a vessel, in front of a unique piece of architecture with oddly familiar imagery, and while certainly not confirmed in game, allow me to postulate on what we're looking at. I believe Entrati's words were quite literal, and the reason this vessel exists here, looks the way it does, and is called the Abandoned Vessel is that, quite frankly, this is part of Entrati's offering, and further, this is where he would communicate with the indifference. Most likely sometime after actually making that deal with the man in the wall he pulled away from the first time. If nothing else, I think it's almost certain this vessel now belongs to the Void. Although deals with the man in the wall seem to be more and more common as time passes, this one in particular is an issue not just because Entrati is perceived to be the first, the reason his doppelganger exists at all, but more than that is the aforementioned obsession with alchemy, and its possible association here because, put quite simply, the end goal of the process Jung described in achieving the divine involves the reintegration of this darker part of himself, or what's assumed to be the final aspect of individuation, In psychology, this process requires confrontation between the ego, what we deem as the ideal version of how we want to be viewed, and the shadow, a kind of remainder of what our consciousness at birth, known as the id, has repressed in order to function among society. This doesn't ever go away and many times can be misinterpreted to be one's conscious, but it's nothing close to that and very much earns the moniker of being considered someone's demon. However, by embracing the aforementioned Nigredo, purification by confrontation in this instance, Entrati is embodying the very words he previously spoke, coming to terms with the demon he knows himself to be, and in the process moving to a more enlightened state, the albedo. Many of you already understand the implications of what's being presented here, but for those that don't, consider that Whispers in the Walls never makes it clear who this is when we are transferred back in time within Arthur's consciousness. Is this the man in the wall? Or is it Entrati, right up until he's overtaken? Not unlike something the Tenno experienced in the past. See, to me, the introduction of all these alchemical aspects very much appears to offer the possibility that this is Entrati and the man in the wall, and that further, there's no longer a differentiation between the two, if the psychological undertones of this campaign are in alignment here. This premise is reinforced by its own Vitruvian imagery, its inspiration being both an assertion of the mathematical perfection of the human body, as well as a metaphysical proposition that man was the center of his own universe, joined in harmony with the divine, Entrati and his void twin, the earth and the heavens, the body and the mind. Whereas the Tenno seem to be in complete opposition to the demands of the void, Entrati instead apparently chose to hide somewhere in the past. Or so he claims, at least. See, he did have a meeting scheduled on the same day, coincidentally, as the one we were sent back to, in a vision supposedly subjugated by the indifference, something only briefly mentioned in the commotion. We know because it's on the phone that lies just outside the Sanctum Anatomica. What's concerning is, we made it to the right day. Did we miss it by mere hours? Or did even that happen according to plan? At one point, Lloyd says to us,
In the version of the past we saw, my Albrecht said we were too late. The solution, naturally, is to arrive on time next time.
but was that actually him? Further, is this Lloyd's pager? Or is it possible that if there is no longer a distinction between the man in the wall and Entrati, that once again we are doing exactly what the indifference wants from us, with Entrati becoming the demon he feels he is, and does the pager's placement here, isolated from the rest of the labs where the indifference showed up at the climax of Whispers in the Walls, mean that this was the same one we see in the introduction of the quest? Entrati has an interesting history of being willing to sacrifice anything to achieve his goals, with some of those goals of, let's say, questionable nature, and that's saying nothing of the family he left behind. Is it possible he has accepted this mindset in order to facilitate a meeting between the two of us, because of the faith that we alone can stop it or him, maybe even giving it a human and thus vulnerable aspect? This would provide a plausible basis regarding Entrati's escapades through time, how he walks about the universe with the accomplishments of a god, how he can visit his past or other dimensions without much in the way of adverse effects or paradoxes. Yet, the ramifications of his actions in the 1999 timeline, having to have altered its trajectory away from the one we experience in our own, with the idea of Arthur being a proto-frame, in what appears to be the earliest evolution of a Warframe, yet still having the ability for us to use transference into him, seeming to keep them on the path to becoming the brutalized suits our Tenno will come to puppet in the future. Time will inevitably tell what our final interaction with the proto-frames will be, but is this Albrecht, the indifference, or both? And if the latter is true, are we walking into a trap? Or has Entrati truly resigned himself to his fate, providing us with a potential window or maybe even a method by which to defeat or more likely subdue this entity, utilizing the entire Kalimos sequence as the beginning of a final desperate act in his seemingly ageless battle with what he initially created in the void? I suppose it all rests upon who you believe him to actually be. A man of nobility, decency, selflessness? Or would you characterize him as a selfless, ambitious megalomaniac? That, dear friends, is up to you, but make no mistake, the constant presence of the indifference, the summoning circles we see in his own admittance to accepting the demon he is, his seemingly manic behavior as well as his immersion into what many consider the esoteric or even occult in nature in conjunction with what is presented during the quest has terrible implications moving forward. And only in Entrati's ascension can any of this be viewed as encouraging. Regardless, one thing is certain. If in fact he did come to terms with his shadow on some level, making the ultimate deal with himself, as this video suggests as a pretty strong possibility, he will have achieved the only goal that his two sides appear to agree upon.
We had a deal. The deal was shook. A little handshake, all it took.
The sands fall, the circuit completes. I return to the place of the beginning.
Though from the deal, the wee child ran.
Let witless hordes bleat their disdain for every fervent plan. The deal is done, the die is cast, yet still I end as I began.
With that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's video and it got you thinking about the Jungian properties of the story within the game. I'll leave a link to a playlist in the description if you're as fascinated with this concept as I am and want to know more, as once you understand this, you really do learn that it's everywhere, many times subconsciously added without the author realizing it, and too much of this seems to fall in line lore-wise to ignore. You may even learn a few things about yourself in the process. At any rate, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.